Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are worthy of your attention and you should perhaps want to do something about. As always, comments, questions, reactions are welcome. You can send them to me directly. My email address, my personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd like. Just please remember, as always, if you do send me email, to include something in the subject line and make it clear that this is not spam, and be a little patient because I am really lousy about answering email, but you will get an answer at some point. Any event, all right, with that, let's get on with it. I'm going to start, as I try to start every week, with some good news. On Tuesday, November 25th, Federal District Judge Christine Baker made it a week to be thankful for same-sex couples in Arkansas, when she ruled that state's ban on same-sex marriage is unconstitutional and cannot be enforced. She stayed the effect of the ruling now, but as I've said any number of times now, that is normal in the course of events of these kind of cases. However, the Arkansas State Supreme Court is also considering another case challenging the law, and if they decide to uphold marriage justice and strike down the ban, well, then the federal case becomes moot. Now, what's more, just hours after that happened, just hours after Judge Baker ruled, Federal District Judge Karl Reeves issued a lengthy, fiery decision striking down Mississippi's discrimination against same-sex couples who just want to be able to get married. That ban, he declared, is not only unconstitutional, but also, and I'm quoting the ruling here, common sense tells us that the application of Mississippi's same-sex marriage ban discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, I've remarked before that it often seems that in all of these pro-justice decisions that have come down, that there's some line, some turn of phrase which is worth noting. Well, Judge Reeves it's rather longer than a phrase, but it still is worth noting, because early in his decision, he laid out 7 questions he said have to be answered. And I'm going to quote them. Can gay and lesbian citizens love? Can gay and lesbian citizens have long-lasting and committed relationships? Can gay and lesbian citizens love and care for their children? Can gay and lesbian citizens provide what is best for their children? Can gay and lesbian citizens help make their children grow into good and productive citizens? Without the right to marry, are gay and lesbian citizens subjected to humiliation and indignity? And without the right to marry, are gay and lesbian citizens subjected to state-sanctioned prejudice? He then said the answer to each of those questions is yes, which he wrote leads the court, quoting him, leads the court to the inescapable conclusion that same-sex couples should be allowed to share in the benefits and burdens, for better or worse, of marriage. Indeed. By the way, I said a few weeks ago in a slightly different context that the real bigots on this, the real dead enders, are not going to give up, but that others among their number will at some point say this is a losing battle and they'll direct their bigotry somewhere else. There are signs that exactly that may be happening. On November 19th, the infamously anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-LGBT rights, a bizarrely misnamed National Organization for Marriage, released its 2013 tax filing. They showed a 50% drop in income from the year before, with just 2 donors amounting for more than half of what they did raise. Its so-called education fund fared even worse. It showed a 70% drop from the year before. And the group ended the year $2.5 million in debt. The investors are clearly moving on to another campaign. Finally, on this, a quick sidebar. On November 28th, Finland became the 18th nation to allow same-sex couples to marry nationwide. All right, on another front, with good news, more and more states are picking up where the federal government has failed to act and are recognizing the need for greater protection and respect for the rights and needs of workers, particularly low-wage workers. Now, the bad news is that this is necessary at all, that we are more and more becoming a low-wage part-time nation. But the good news here is that, again, more states and municipalities are recognizing the need to do something in response. For one example, on November 25th, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors unanimously passed the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights, the country's first ever legislation aimed at improving life for retail employees. Retail chains that have 11 or more locations across the country and employ 20 or more people in San Francisco will now have to provide their workers at least 2 weeks' notice of their schedules. Failure to do so will mean having to give those workers additional predictability pay. Disrupted lives based on shifting schedules, which are posted on short notice, have become a major complaint among particularly, but not exclusively, part-time workers. Some of those workers, in fact, don't even know if they're going to work a given shift until they actually show up to do it. The San Francisco measure will also require employers to improve the treatment of part-time employees, give current workers the opportunity to take on more hours before the company hires somebody else. It will pay on-call people whose shifts get canceled, and give part-time employees the same starting wage as full-time employees doing the same job, and also provide them access to the same benefits. Second, a week later, December 2nd, the Chicago City Council voted 44-5 to pass fast-tracked legislation to raise the minimum wage in Chicago from the current $8.25 an hour to $13 an hour by 2019, with the first step in that a raise to $10 an hour to occur next year. You know, and part of the reason this kind of thing is happening, to tell you the truth, is that in another bit of unfortunately necessary but still good news, low-wage workers are themselves getting fed up. And they are fed up enough to ignore retaliation, to ignore the threat of being fired, and they are taking to the streets. For one example on that, Friday, November 30th, marked the third consecutive year of protests and strikes against Walmart. The protest under the banner of $15 in full-time, that is $15 an hour minimum wage and full-time work for anybody who wants it, were led by a group called Our Walmart, which is a labor-backed worker group which has been staging and organizing these protests, which occurred alongside community and labor support groups in various cities. Thousands of Walmart employees and labor union members and other supporters protested at 1,000 Walmart stores across the country. At least 11 workers and supporters were arrested for civil disobedience for blocking traffic outside of Walmart in Chicago. These actions came after a week in which workers walked off the job in 10 states, employees in Los Angeles staged a fast, and workers in D.C. orchestrated a sit-in where the association put masking tape over their mouths in order to protest Walmart, quote, silencing of employees who complain about working conditions, unquote. Now, Dan Schlaterman of Making Change at Walmart, this is a project of the United Food and Concession Workers. They support this campaign against Walmart. He said he expects the number of strikers to be in the hundreds by the end of the day. Now, that number seems to be and actually is small compared to Walmart's total workforce. But let's not forget that just a couple of years ago, the idea of this happening at all would have been unthinkable. From there, we move on to some not good news. I came across this the other day, and it just sort of hurt my heart. In 2000, the World Health Organization embarked on a campaign to get children across the world immunized against measles, which was still a significant killer of children. The goal was to reduce deaths from measles by 95% by 2015. By 2012, that goal looked in reach. The number of children who died yearly from measles had dropped from 583,000 in 2000 to 122,000 in 2012, a drop of 81%. But the WHO now reports that in 2013, the number of measles deaths in children around the world went up to nearly 146,000, which raises serious doubts about meeting the goal of a 95% cut by next year. The greater tragedy here, the real tragedy here, and the real reason that I found this so upsetting, is that the measles vaccine is easily available and relatively affordable. Even in the developing world, it costs about $1 per child. But governments and private partners who have been contributing to the immunization effort have slashed their funding, slashed their support, with resultant vaccination programs in a number of countries have stalled or even stopped completely, leaving tens of millions of children, particularly in countries like Pakistan, India, and Nigeria, vulnerable to a disease that potentially could leave them brain damaged or blind even if they survive. Now, you got to understand something. This is an international program. It's being done through UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, which means it's internationally funded. It's not that the governments such as India, Pakistan, and Nigeria unilaterally cut their own budgets to immunize their own people. It's that the world community has. And the people most affected, as is often the case, are the poor. In fact, the poorest of the poor, which is probably why, in the eyes of too many governments, the lives of those children are literally not worth $1. I also actually have a footnote to that. I'm aware that there are those in the U.S. who declare that they will not have their children immunized, not have their children vaccinated, on the claim that vaccines are, or rather something in the vaccines is, connected to autism. And that there is some sort of vast conspiracy of silence in the U.S. government, particularly in the Centers for Disease Control, to hide that fact. Now, at least some of these people say, and I know this because I've had this argued to me directly, that there's no need for them to take that risk with their child because so many other children get immunized that there's really no real chance of them getting the disease in the first place. Those people are wrong. They're wrong scientifically, they are wrong ethically, and they're wrong practically. Wrong scientifically because there is no legitimate evidence, there is no reliable evidence that the substance in question, it's actually a mercury-containing compound which is called thiomersal internationally and thimerosal in the U.S. There's actually no reliable scientific evidence that this stuff is actually connected to autism. They're wrong ethically because by their own argument, they want everybody else to risk their children so that they don't have to risk theirs. They want everybody else to take the same risk that they refuse to take in order to protect them. And they're wrong practically because the net effect of their decision is to increase the risk of their children getting measles. After the live measles vaccine was introduced in the United States in the early 1960s, the number of new cases of measles plummeted from over 500,000 in 1962 to just 37 in 2004. But by the end of October this year, there were already over 600 cases in 2014, making it the worst year in at least 20 years in the United States. And I frankly can't help but wonder how many of those kids had parents who said, I won't get my kid immunized because, Dad, they'll never get measles. Finally, before the break, I have an update on something. A couple of weeks ago, in running down some good news that came out of the November elections, I noted that the town of Denton, Texas, had voted by a wide margin to ban fracking within city limits. Now, fracking, again, short for hydraulic fracturing, it's a means of increasing production from an oil or natural gas well by pumping a mix of water, sludge, and some varying brew of toxic chemicals into a well under such pressure that this fluid literally fractures the surrounding rock, allowing that more oil and gas to escape out of those fissures and so be pumped out. Well, the residents of Denton, one of the most heavily fracked communities in the entire state of Texas, complained about poor air quality, noise, and an increase in low-magnitude earthquakes associated with the process. So they voted to ban it. But to show you, as if such a show is actually needed, what happens when right-wingers who screech about small government and local control, what they do when that conflicts with the desires of big money, just 2 days after the vote, Christy Craddock, the chairwoman of the state commission which regulates oil and gas in Texas, said she would simply ignore the ban and go right on issuing fracking permits in Denton. Revealingly, her reasoning was, and this is quoting her, "It's my job to give permits, not Denton's. We're going to continue permitting up there because that's my job." Actually, Ms. Craddock, your job is supposed to be to regulate. But I'm not surprised that what you think your job is to just hand out fracking permits like candy and frack baby frack. She also claimed, by the way, that the vote was the result of misinformation and that the oil and gas industry should have done a better job of communicating with the voters. However, according to the Dallas Morning News, the fracking ban question was the most expensive political issue ever in history of Denton. And it was one in which the major oil and gas companies spent $685,000. Remember, this is one question in a municipal election. They spent $685,000 outspending environmentalists supporting the ban by around 30-1. Yeah, right-winger definition of what makes an illegitimate election among uninformed voters. It's one they lose. We're taking a break. Here we are back again. All right, something I'm not going to spend any significant amount of time on this week, but I will get to very soon, and I just wanted to mention it now. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out last month, and it sounds an increasingly loud alarm to a world that still seems determined to not pay attention. The growing risks of climate change are so profound, this report said, that they could stall or even reverse generations of progress against poverty and hunger if greenhouse gases continue to at their current pace. Failure to reduce such emissions could threaten society with food shortages, refugee crises, the flooding of major cities and even entire island nations, mass extinction of plants and animals, and a climate so drastically altered that it might become dangerous for people to work or play outside at certain times of the year. And 2014 is now looking very much like it's going to be the hottest year on record, beating out 2010, which beat out 2005, and so much for the nonsense that global warming has stopped. Now, speaking of stopping, I'll stop there because I want to spend some significant time on this, which I will do very soon. Instead, I'm going to go to one of our occasional features. It's called the Hero Award, and it's given as the occasion arises to someone who just does the right thing on a matter big or small. This time, our hero is Australian newscaster Karl Stefanovic. He's co-host of the Australian version of the Today Show, and he engaged in what you might well call some performance art to protest sexism. His co-host is a woman named Lisa Wilkinson, and she regularly receives unsolicited fashion advice and criticisms about her appearance from the audience for the show. Stefanovic became frustrated with this and decided to conduct an experiment. Except for, he said, a couple of occasions when circumstances dictated otherwise, he wore the same blue suit on the air every day for a year to see if anyone would notice or care. No one did. But women, he said, and I'm quoting him now, women, they wear the wrong color and they get pulled up. They say the wrong thing and there's thousands of tweets written about them. I'm judged on how I do my job, basically. Women are quite often judged on what they're wearing or how their hair is. And for demonstrating that fact so clearly and so cleverly, Karl Stefanovic is a hero. All right, now for one of our regular features, it's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. This week's winners of the Big Red Nose are 125 members of the Seattle, Washington Police Department. Several years ago, the Department of Justice began investigating the Seattle police after several high-profile incidents of excessive force. In 2011, the investigation concluded that officers there used excessive force about 20% of the time. Now, it noted that, quoting the report, the great majority of the city's police officers are honorable law enforcement professionals, but that didn't change the fact that a subset of officers continued to abuse their authority and to abuse force, which frankly is probably true of most police forces. Now, as part of a settlement with the DOJ, over the past year, the Seattle PD has reviewed its policies and revised its policies on when police can use force. In response, those 125 officers, about 10% of the police union's membership, and by the way, I'll mention the union was not part of this, it was these officers. These 125 police officers responded by filing a lawsuit challenging the new rules. Now, in their filing, which is essentially a long-winded whine about how it's tough to be a cop, the cops argue that the new rules violate their constitutional rights under the 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments, which I gather are the only ones they've ever heard of, because otherwise they would have included the others. The brief asserts that cops have a constitutional right to not de-escalate a situation before turning to lethal force. They asserted that their use of force is constitutionally protected, quoting the brief, regardless of whether or not there existed less intrusive means or alternatives to self-defense or defense of others, such as inflicting a less serious injury to, retreating from, or containing or negotiating with a suspect. In other words, these cops are asserting they have a constitutional right to use excessive, unnecessary force. More bluntly, they can use any level of force, up to and including shooting somebody to death, anytime they think they should, and nobody can get to say boo. Now, happily, these Tauntaun Makut wannabes, and yeah, look it up. These Tauntaun Makut wannabes had their case summarily rejected by a federal judge who declared that they fundamentally misunderstood, even grossly misconstrued, quote unquote, the constitutional protections they were claiming for themselves. And they very likely will fare no better if they go on appeal. But that doesn't change the fact that 10% of the police force of a major city have said in effect that they believe they have the right to beat you, even to kill you, even if alternatives exist. 10% of the Seattle Police Department, not the whole department, but 1 out of every 10 of them, like this one caught punching a woman in the face, 10% of the Seattle Police Department consists of clowns. Dangerous, ignorant, heavily armed clowns, but clowns. And that, in fact, brings us smoothly to our other regular weekly feature. It's the Outrage of the Week. And this week, I'm actually sure that you know what it is. And the whole thing can be summed up in a single word: Ferguson. Okay, it happened. We knew it would. We expected it would. We kept hoping it wouldn't, but we knew it would. Which is why, even though the taste is so bitter, the disappointment so sharp, there is no sense of surprise. Just the aching hurt of seeing it happen yet again. Another black man, or another black teenager, or another black child is shot to death by another white cop, and another white cop walks. It has long since become depressingly, disgustingly predictable. No probable cause. Not even for involuntary manslaughter. No probable cause. Darren Wilson did nothing at all when he shot down Michael Brown, we're told. Nothing at all. In fact, according to St. Louis County Prosecutor Robert McCulloch, who sounded more like a defense attorney doing a trial summation than a prosecutor, he was just defending himself. Wilson feared for his life. So shooting Brown down and then leaving the body lying in the street for 4 hours, not even bothering to call paramedics, that was just, well, it was okay. It was reasonable, appropriate. He was just defending himself. Now, how do we know that's so? How do we know that that's the actual truth of the matter? How do we know that for sure? Because Darren Wilson is a cop. And Michael Brown, well, he was unimportant, irrelevant. Just another black guy who got aggressive or often enough just mouthy with a cop. And we all know or are supposed to know and accept that in that case, the white cops cannot be held responsible for whatever happens after that, because the cop followed guidelines or followed procedure. Guidelines and procedures that should result in cops' badge numbers starting with 00 whenever they deal with young black men. Because there almost never is, probable cause. Now, there's much more to talk about here, about the sloppy, error-filled investigation, non-investigation by the police, who didn't even bother to take measurements or photographs of the scene, about the fact that Wilson clearly changed his story in at least 2 different ways between his initial police report and his testimony before the grand jury, about how Wilson's testimony invoked racist cliches about the super powerful black man who made him feel like a 5-year-old battling Hulk Hogan, and about the black man who looked like a demon. There's a whole lot more to talk about, but I will, for the moment, end with this. The legal purpose of grand juries is supposed to be as a check on arbitrary prosecution, a way of making prosecutors show they have enough evidence to bring something to trial. For that reason, they usually only hear the prosecution case. If that's not good enough for a trial, there's no need for a defense case. But in this case, the prosecutor, McCulloch, by his own account, introduced everything. Which means instead of providing any guidance, instead of providing any organization, he basically just dumped everything they had into the grand jury's lap and said, you figure it out. This also means, by the way, that he, of necessity, by definition, included and introduced any exculpatory evidence that he may have had, evidence that normally would be presented by the defense at trial, not at the prosecution before the grand jury. Because as much as grand juries are in legal fiction independent bodies, they are in reality creatures of the prosecution. In a famous quote from former New York State Judge Saul Wachtler, if they wanted to, a district attorney could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. In 2010, the most recent year for which we have figures, U.S. attorneys prosecuted 162,000 cases. Grand juries declined to return an indictment in precisely 11 of them. Now, that's not exactly comparable because those are federal grand juries and this was a state grand jury, but still, the point remains. A prosecutor who really wants an indictment can get one. And a prosecutor who really does not want an indictment and who has gone to a grand jury only because of political pressure or social protest and doesn't have the guts to admit that they don't want an indictment can ensure that there isn't one. I say here for the record, I will go to my grave convinced, and there are a good number of legal experts, including defense attorneys and former prosecutors who agree with me on this, I will go to the grave convinced that prosecutor Robert McCulloch wanted Darren Wilson to walk scot-free. And he manipulated the grand jury system to make that happen, and justice can go to hell. And that is an outrage. That's it for this week. We are out of here. You have the best week you possibly can. Peace.